There is nothing wrong with your screen. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We can roll the image, make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur or sharpen it to crystal clarity. For the remainder of this video, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the breakdown and review of The Outer Limits. Please subscribe.
And welcome everybody to the Geeking Poetic podcast channel. I'm your host Larry Roberts, and it has been a while, but we are finally back with another installment of our Outer Limits review series. Yes, we are going to be watching every episode of The Outer Limits and reviewing it, talking about it, giving our impressions of it. This is a series that I grew up on as a kid. I loved it. It freaked me out, it made me think, and I know a lot of you feel the same way because I've had a lot of great comments. Thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed and has liked and left comments on the Outer Limits videos, as well as the other stuff that we put out there. Keep it coming. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Hit that bell so that you know when we have more content coming out. We have a lot of other stuff that we do on this channel besides just Outer Limits and sci-fi. We do music stuff, we do top 5 movies and comics, toys. We just cover everything that we geek out about here at Geeking Poetic. And yeah, without any further ado, let's get into some Outer Limits talk. So in this episode of our ongoing look at the Outer Limits series, we are talking about episode 7 from season 1 that is titled O.B.I.T or O.B.I.T, which we come to discover is an abbreviation for a machine, a mysterious machine that the Department of Defense is using, and it stands for Outer Bank Individuated Teletracer. Now, as the pre-credits opening scene starts, we see a man with glasses and a particularly hairy hand staring at some odd computer screen where suddenly a weird-looking, creepy monster is walking towards him on the screen. When the episode starts properly post-credits, we see a military man sitting there operating this computer. He appears to be spying on people somehow using this. He's watching people talk about other people they work with, and he's taking notes on it. And before too long, he himself ends up seeing this same hideous creature on the computer screen. As he's sitting there looking at it, he suddenly realizes that this creature is behind him. Except when he turns around at first, he has a look like he recognizes the person he's looking at, but then the creature starts to choke him. Now, we do notice in a cutaway scene when you see it from behind that the creature is not actually choking him. It is a man who also happens to have a particularly hairy hand like we just saw in the opening sequence. And it turns out this is all happening from a surveillance room at the Cypress Hill Research Center, which is being utilized by the Defense Department to monitor all of their employees using this strange computer machine. And they're using it to watch people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And Cypress Hill is a top-secret defense installation, which is being overseen in part by Colonel Glover, and the man in charge of heading the O.B.I.T program is one Mr. Byron Lomax. Now, sometime shortly after this murder by this creature occurs, they are visited by one Senator Orville, who's played by Peter Breck. Mr. Lomax doesn't seem happy at all to see Senator Orville there, and Orville plans on holding some sort of investigative hearing into this murder. Now, the senator is not only concerned about the murder that happened, but he's also concerned about reports of other things that have been happening at this center, namely employees complaining about being depressed, having substance abuse problems, divorces, even suicides, with paranoia, anger, and just overall low morale that he seems to believe is connected to this machine that they're now utilizing. Not least of which because this machine has been prying into the public and private lives of all those around it. At one point, with one employee even labeling it as a peeping Tom device. Now, some of these problems may have occurred before, but they have greatly escalated ever since this O.B.I.T machine was implemented into their lives. And now when you add a mysterious murder on top of it, well, the senator's not having it, and he is determined to get to the bottom of what is going on here. After Orville's questioning, it is quickly revealed that little to no information is available on where these machines came from and who provided it, who designed it. They have no answers for him. Mr. Lomax takes the stand and proceeds to give a demonstration on just how the machine works to Senator Orville and his committee members. And he demonstrates how it can locate people within a certain distance based on a certain code that belongs to each individual human being, sort of like how a fingerprint is an individual thing to every human on the planet. And when the senator presses Mr. Lomax as to whether or not he feels that it is ethical and right to use this machine to pry into people's lives, Lomax seems completely dismissive of it and says that, well, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear. And it's definitely an interesting quote given how we've seen that kind of ideology used at various points throughout history. And for a TV show that's over 60 years old, it's amazing how relevant that still is nowadays. But in any case, Senator Orville is not having any of this, and he is immediately concerned as to whether or not only this machine is really fair and ethical to use on people, but whether it could be causing a lot more harm than good. This fact gets highlighted even more when he learns that one of the people heading up the whole O.B.I.T program, the head of the facility known as Dr. Clifford Scott, recently had a complete breakdown, was now unreachable due to him being confined to a rest home of some sort. Speaking of Dr. Scott, his estranged wife Barbara is also called in to speak at these hearings. She seems very troubled about the whole thing, and we see that she has some kind of connection to Lomax that isn't really explained right away. But he also seems to be very dismissive of her concerns and seems to be almost coaching her on how she should respond and how she should act during these hearings. She ends up telling the senator that her husband did become more and more troubled over time, especially once he started using the O.B.I.T machine, and that it ended up causing a lot of problems for their marriage, ultimately ending up with them being separated. And then at one point, him claiming that he saw a monster on the screen while he was spying on her using the O.B.I.T. At this point, Orville decides that enough's enough. It is time to locate Dr. Scott and get the full story from him as to what exactly he saw on this machine, and determine if there's any connection to the murder that happened just recently. The senator and the colonel managed to track down Scott and his whereabouts at the rest home he is staying at. And at first, Dr. Scott is none too happy to open up and talk about his situation. But once he realizes that the senator seems to be not only believing what he has to say, but more specifically, asking the right questions. At that point, Scott then realizes that he has to tell his full story and admits that he doesn't believe he's crazy and he didn't believe he was just seeing things. He knows that he saw an actual monstrous creature on the O.B.I.T screen when he was spying on his wife, and that the whole reason he decided to check into this facility was because he was afraid of what might happen to him if he kept talking about this, basically theorizing that the government and whomever else might be in on this conspiracy with this machine and this hideous monster that keeps being seen. Orville pressures Scott into changing his mind and agreeing to come to the hearings to tell his side of the story. Scott's not too sure about that, fearing for his safety and bringing up how there is a specific person there who will not want him to tell the truth. Now, meanwhile, while all that's going on, things are getting further complicated by the fact that we see Lomax talking to a creature on the O.B.I.T screen. It looks like he's using his own personal machine that's in a hotel room somewhere, and he's telling the creature that there was another man that worked at the facility that saw the creature leaving after he had killed the previous worker, and now was going to be called to testify about what he saw. He ends up sending the creature over to kill this witness so that he cannot testify. And sure enough, the next day when Senator Orville finds out that this witness is missing and can't be found, he has just had enough. At this point, he angrily calls Colonel Grover to the stand. And before too long, Grover ends up kind of breaking under questioning. He ends up admitting that he thinks that these machines are horrible and that they're extremely addictive, and that he himself has become completely addicted to it. And it's revealed that these machines are not only available in military facilities and government facilities, but they're also now being found in people's homes and people's businesses. These things are suddenly spreading out there, and people are using it, and it's affecting everybody very negatively. At this point, Orville ends up surprising Lomax and everybody in the court by calling Dr. Clifford Scott to the stand. It turns out that Scott decided to come after all and explain the story. He gets on the stand and he starts telling the story about how he became obsessed with the thought of his wife cheating on him, not least of which because Lomax at one point had conveniently showed him images of Barbara supposedly flirting with another officer. It wound up becoming an obsession for Scott, and it totally ruined his marriage and it ruined his mind. At one point, he realized that she was in fact actually seeing another man. He could see on the screen that she was talking to another man, but he could never see the man. So basically, he explained that after some tinkering and fooling with the computer, he was able to finally see who she was talking to, and it turns out that was when he saw the creature. But when asked, "Do you know who this creature is?" he says, "Yes, I do now, because the way I figured it out was the creature had to be somebody that could not be dialed up normally, and everybody around, everybody at the facility was able to be located by the O.B.I.T except for one person." As it's probably no surprise to a lot of people, that one person turned out to be Byron Lomax, the man with the hairy hand. Almost immediately when it's revealed that Lomax is the monster, Lomax doesn't run or try to deny it. He immediately stands up and declares that this is the truth to Orville and the rest of the people in attendance. He defiantly exclaims his purpose and the plan, and that he and his alien race had intentionally infiltrated the human race with these O.B.I.T computers, knowing that human beings would not be able to help themselves but use these things to spy on each other and to know each other's deepest, darkest secrets. But at the same time, it would make their own lives miserable. And he knew that without guns or any kind of war, this was going to be the way to bring down the human race. Eventually meaning that he and his alien people could come to the planet and basically subjugate it and take it over for themselves. Lomax concludes by pointing out to them the fact that, quote, "You're all of the same dark persuasion. You demand and insist on knowing every private thought and hunger of everyone. Your families, your neighbors, everyone but yourselves." He also tells them that even if they try to smash and get rid of all the computers they know of, he will bring more O.B.I.T machines. They'll never be able to stop it and keep up with it. Obviously, at this point, this is all the confession that Orville needs, and he signals for the guards to take Lomax into custody. But before they can do that, Lomax raises his hand and he just disappears. And one of the best parts about this episode is the scene that we just saw in the courtroom when Lomax is giving his testimonial about what his alien race plans on doing. It's a really cool effect they do where you see on the screen he as the alien gesturing and moving around, but then you see besides it, he in the presence of everybody else there as a human doing the same gestures. It's a cheap effect, but it's really effective. It's really cool. It's very hair-raising. I can imagine how hair-raising it had to be back in 1963. At that point, obviously shook and bewildered, Senator Orville, the Colonel, the Scotts, and the rest of the people in attendance silently walk out of the room as we hear the voiceover tell us that the only way to eventually possibly stop this invasion will depend on all of us and the choices we make. And with that, the 7th episode of Season 1 of The Outer Limits, known as O.B.I.T, has concluded. And that's basically it for O.B.I.T. This episode, I really like this episode. I think it's pretty ominous and chilling at points, and it definitely gives the audience a lot to ponder. Like I said earlier, it's interesting how a lot of the themes in this episode are ones that have stayed with us for years, not least of which because there is some real world, juxtaposition to be doing with these themes. We do see stuff like this come up from time to time, especially when new technologies are developed and when people get obsessed with those new technologies and the debate on whether or not it's actually good for us or not. Not least of which in the way some people tend to weaponize it or use it for nefarious reasons that are not necessarily the most ethical means of using these things. Now, interestingly, I've seen some people online, some other Outer Limits fans, who have criticized this episode and said they didn't think it was very good. I actually really liked this episode quite a bit. As always, Outer Limits has some of the greatest camera work from any show from back then, and even now I think it's impressive. The way they use tense close-ups and certain angles, the way they use shadows. This episode is no exception. I think they did great work with all of that. I think the show's cast very well. I think it's a very well thought out script. Yes, it's a little bit slow at times, especially for a lot of modern viewers who are not used to this much space taken in between scenes and lines. I love it. I think it adds to the tension of the story. And while you do figure out pretty early on that Lomax is not necessarily a good guy or somebody that is likely to be trusted, I think they did a pretty good job at least of keeping the big reveal of he and his alien race and what their plan was until the very end of the episode. And as a side note for anybody that might be curious, his alien race is actually referred to in the script as the Helosians, though they never ended up actually mentioning that in the actual show. And truthfully, if there's any downside I can say about this, I'd say that this is such a good story and such a potentially intricate story, with especially when you're getting into the story of how this was affecting people like Dr. Scott and his wife and how it was affecting all the other workers and a lot of other things that could have easily been interwoven into this. This actually could have been much longer than it was. It's only at this point, what, a 50-minute TV episode. This actually would make a really, really good movie. And so this does leave me wanting a little bit more, but that being said, it really doesn't take away from the greatness of this episode. I think O.B.I.T is a really good one. If you haven't seen it in a long time, or if you haven't watched it because you've seen negative reviews of it from some of the other fans out there, honestly, I think you should give it a chance, especially if you don't mind the more slow-paced kind of dark noir type of episodes like O.B.I.T tends to be. I think the threat and the themes that are presented in O.B.I.T are still relevant and thought-provoking even today. And that's it for me for this time around. I hope you all enjoyed my little review and discussion of this Outer Limits episode. Again, leave your comments. Let me know, do you like this episode? Do you not like this episode? Were there certain things about this episode that you thought stood out from other ones? I'd love to hear all of that. That's the whole reason I'm doing this, is because I'm a fan and I want to hear from other fans what you think of these episodes too. We'll be back hopefully sooner than later. I plan to try and get this ball rolling again with the Outer Limits reviews. It's been a crazy year, but hopefully we're going to get things moving here. And as I said before, I'm going to have all sorts of other content coming out, all of my music stuff, my top fives, all that geeky stuff that I and us here at Geeking Poetic Podcast love to talk about. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit that bell, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. So take it easy, everybody.